The Medlin Cemetery in Trophy Cliff, Texas is a place of nostalgia and comfort for me. In 2008, my father passed away when I was 7 years old, leaving me and my mother and my two aunts, Aunt Janet and Aunt Sissy, going out in the evenings to visit his grave and enjoy the nature of the cemetery and oftentimes cleaning up other graves surrounding it. The scenery became familiar and comfortable to me, as we oftentimes spent evenings walking around the cemetery and trying to find the oldest grave in the graveyard. We learned so much history about this place and oftentimes looked at other graves as well and tried to learn about the people that were buried there too. At the age of 7, I didn't really know what it meant to grieve a loved one, but spending so much time in the cemetery and learning how peaceful it could be, it was my own way of grieving, I now realize now at the age of 20. My grandmother and my mom's mom also passed away in 2017 and was buried only 30 feet away from my dad's grave. Through the years, going to visit her and my dad, I've learned so many things about the cemetery and how peaceful it makes me feel and calms all my anxieties. I like to oftentimes go out and sit out there and walk around and enjoy how serene it is. Through the years, I've learned many things about the cemetery and what truly makes me feel the best. I like listening to the wind chimes that blow from each grave through the wind, and that's the only sound you can hear. The cemetery is in a pretty obsolete location, so there's not other sounds that go on and bother things, but between the birds chirping and flying around and the crunching of the leaves and the wind chimes, it really creates a peaceful place. When I was younger, when my dad first passed away, my Aunt Janet and I would oftentimes walk around the cemetery and learn a bit about the history of the place. We would look at different old graves and try and talk about these people's lives as if we actually knew them. One of our quests was to find the oldest grave buried in the graveyard, which belonged to Mittie Ann Medlin. The Medlin family was the first to settle here and make the cemetery what it really is today. I like the story and the history of Mittie Ann and the Medlin family. Learning about her is interesting, and I like comparing her to me in the sense that she would go out to the hill where the cemetery now is and admire the land and the beauty of the place, and she said she would like to be buried here one day after they had moved from far up north down to Roanoke, Texas. I like comparing her to me in the sense that I oftentimes go out to the cemetery and looking for a sense of peace and calm collectedness. Mittie and I both have that in common with loving the land the way it is. The Medlin family settled in Roanoke, Texas in 1847. Only 3 years later did Mittie pass away, and she was the first to be buried in this land. She's honored with a statue in the middle of the cemetery and a historical marker telling all about the Medlin family. It kind of ties the whole place together in my opinion, because I really like the honoring of Mittie in this place. Mittie's grave is surrounded by her many relatives, such as her brothers and sisters and her dad and her mom. Her brother went on years later, after Mittie had passed away and both her parents had passed away, to start selling plots for the graves surrounding Mittie's and her family's to raise money for maintenance and make it an actual cemetery. Acres of land were purchased by the Medlin family, and the cemetery is now what it is today, the Medlin Cemetery. It's expanded quite a bit, and people are still being buried there today, but it has the same peace and beautiful nature that it did before. Along with learning about the history of the place, my aunt and I would also like to look at cool headstones. Some were shaped like cool rocks, some were just had weird names on them, and we just liked to look at them and they were fascinating. One of the ones that fascinated me from a young age is one that looks like a tree trunk. It always confused me as to why there was a cement tree trunk in the graveyard, but my aunt and I finally walked over to it one day and realized it was actually a headstone to a grave. We found out later on, after some research, that this meant that the person buried here belonged to a lumber union or was a lumberjack, which was really interesting to me and I still find fascinating to this day. Since growing up in Trophy Cliff, Texas, right down the street from this graveyard, I feel like I know this cemetery like the back of my hand. I know almost every name on every headstone, and I like to think that I know this place better than anyone else, even though many of these graves belong to many different families still, and many people probably come out here and think the exact same thing as I do. But to me, this place is not only a sense of peace and serenity and calm, but nostalgia and makes me feel closer to my lost loved ones. To this day, I like to go out to the cemetery and visit with those that I love, such as my family members or my boyfriend or some friends. The cemetery is a place of happiness for me, and I like sharing it with those that surround me, and I like telling the story of the cemetery with others that like to listen. So I hope you all enjoy hearing about the story of this place called the Medlin Cemetery and what it really means to me.